So, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Kat. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our July First Friday event. And we're absolutely delighted to have Stewart and John to join us to talk about and look at franchising and franchise legislation. And is franchise legislation required in the UK? Yes or no, basically. Um, I really do need to extend a massive thank you to Stuart in particular. John, always we're delighted to have you with us, but I really need to extend a massive thank you to Stuart for joining us this morning in the UK. It's now 11 o'clock. We're normally 1 o'clock, and Stuart is joining us from Auckland in New Zealand, which is absolutely fabulous to have you. So, without further ado, I'm going to stop this share. Stuart, I'm going to pass it over to you. And again, just for the purpose of the group discussion that we're going to move on to, we're obviously looking at franchise legislation from a legal point of view. But as one of the non-franchise lawyers in the room, we obviously always look at it also from a commercial point of view. So even though we're talking about the legislation, at the end of the day, it's about is legislation good for franchising? Franchising is good for the UK economy. Franchising is good for small business. If it's good for franchising, it's good for us, and if it's not, then it isn't, basically. End of. So very simply, that's the end of the meeting today. But no, I'm going to pass it over to you, Stuart. If you could spend a few minutes and give us your background, a bit of experience, and then
Sure.
come on to the specific questions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julie. And a good morning to you all. It's 10 o'clock in Auckland, New Zealand. So for those of you who haven't been to New Zealand, it's a pretty exciting country. We've only got 5.6 million people. We're the size of Great Britain, where I think you've got 70 million, and it's a similar size. And so the Auckland's the biggest city in the North Island. So I got into franchising 45 years ago. I picked it early as a great way of doing business in New Zealand when I was younger. And then I started my own firm in 1993, and then I could push the brand of SGL, which I've done. So I specialize in franchising and licensing. Probably 80% of or more of my work is franchising. I'm also a qualified mediator. I really believe in dispute resolution. I've had 3 mediations this year, and they've all succeeded, and there's parties have agreed. I've got a partner who, and I've known John Pratt for many years, and Sophie for many years. And so Sophie met my partner in Washington, DC in May at the Legal Symposium. She's Kusbu Sindage, and she's been with me 10 years. I just love franchising. And as we're going to come to talk about the New Zealand situation, but there's no franchise legislation in New Zealand. The Franchise Association, funnily enough, yesterday turned 30. So in 1996, it was formed. I was one of the original 15. I did the constitution documents. 15 people were needed to sign for an incorporated society. And then I wrote the rules for fans, as it's known, and the code of practice and ethics, and they haven't changed much in the 30 years. I'm also a lecturer. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Auckland. I lecture in franchise law. I've done that for 4 years now. And last year, the class, we had 106. I had 106 LLB honours students, and the time before was 28. So it jumped dramatically. There's a real interest in franchising in New Zealand, which you'll realise when we talk about the legislation. And I was also greatly honoured by King Charles III in the New Year's Honours List. So I got what's called an Officer of New Zealand Order of Merit for services to franchise law. And I've done a lot of work in charity. So that elevated franchise law, because that's the first time it's ever been recognised in New Zealand. So that was a great honour. I live in Auckland. I've got 4 children, 2 girls, 1 girl's in Sydney in private equity. I've got identical twin boys who are both medical doctors, and my youngest girl's a clinical psychologist. And I've been blessed with 9 grandchildren. So it's very exciting. And I've been married to Janice for 45 years.
Okay, that's
All right.
absolutely lovely. Thank you very much, Stuart. John,
Pleasure.
would you like to take the floor and give us? I think I think a lot of people on the call know who you are, but for anyone who watches the recording, it would be just useful to have 30 seconds.
No, I'm not even going to do 30 seconds. I can't compete with Stuart. He's going to come across as much more important, interesting, and clever
Uh,
than I
no,
am. So there you are.
don't give up yet, John. You're a
I've
tremendous.
given up. It's too late. I've given up.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
in terms of the questions, I think you shared some suggested questions with both of you earlier in the week. So we'll come to the first question, John, and I'll put it to you first, and then pass over to Stuart to talk about the potential risks and benefits of franchise legislation. I know that's a very broad, open question. You know, two franchisors, two franchisees, two franchising generally, basically. What are the benefits? What are the risks?
Well, Julie, the first question on your list was, is franchise legislation needed in the UK?
Mm,
So should we do the first one first?
that's a good
Um,
idea.
if you wish to do so, John, as always, I follow your lead.
Yeah, you never do, Julie. Anyway, look. So the question is, do we need legislation in the UK? Need legislation, not whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Do we need it? And I think that question can be answered really simply. No. The BFA and NIC produced a report on franchising in 2024. We've got over 1,000 systems operating in the UK on franchising. The contribution of franchising to the UK economy is just under 20 billion pounds, and 89%, so 9 out of 10 franchisees are operating profitably. So I think that's a pretty clear indication
Mm,
that franchising is really successful in the UK. And certainly anecdotally, because I do a lot of international franchising, I think we are an extremely ethical franchising country, even though there is no legislation. So why is there all of a sudden this interest in franchise legislation? Well, two things happened. First of all, McDonald's has been in the news with sexual harassment problems at some of its units. And secondly, Vodafone franchisees are bringing a huge claim against Vodafone. Um, the point about those two is that there is no legislation anywhere in the world that would have addressed those problems. And so typically for members of parliament, they see a problem and they think that legislation is the answer. I'm not sure that it is. Um, I'm a sort of skeptical neutral about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm absolutely convinced it's not required. Um, and just one last thing before Stuart um, comes in. Um, the idea of franchisees being the little guys has some validity, but only limited validity. The Economist, I don't know if you won't, none of you will be able to see this, but The Economist produced an article about a month ago, heading Franchising Has Quietly Made Countless Americans Rich. And it
mm,
focused in that article on a guy called Greg Flynn, who had 3,000 franchise units, 7 brands. He operated in 3 countries, and he had a net worth of over $1 billion. So I think we need to get away. Of course, there are little guys and girls in franchising, but more and more, particularly in the quick service restaurant sector, we're seeing really powerful franchisees. Um, so is it needed? No, but we'll carry on and talk about whether it could be a good thing or not.
Thank you, John. Stuart?
yeah, great opening, John. And I also read that article in The Economist, and I met Greg Flynn. He's very impressive. So I agree with John. The answer is no. I think the BFA does an excellent job, and I think you've got ethical franchising. And if I look at New Zealand, we're the same. So we have no franchise legislation. As I said, the Franchise Association has been going 30 years, and the turnover in franchising in New Zealand is 47 billion, and it contributes 11% to New Zealand's GDP. There's 546 franchise systems, according to the 2024 survey. The litigation is low. The only litigation is really in enforcing non-compete clauses where franchisees are either terminated or they don't renew and they decide to compete and take IP from the franchisor. So I've been involved in a number of those cases, but otherwise it's working really well. We have a disclosure document. Then you'll say, well, what about the members who don't belong to FANS, as we call it? And FANS has about 200 members, so 200 don't belong, or more than 200. But again, because we're a small country, the franchising grapevine is very strong, and you hear of bad things. So in my 45 years of franchising practice, there were what I call cowboys around for 20 years, but they've really gone now because they don't get far. People know. People are more attuned and do their due diligence and see a franchising lawyer and an accountant. So I totally agree with John. I don't think the UK needs any regulation or laws specific to franchising and what you're going to have. I mean, if you have a disclosure document like the US with an FDD and the examples John gave then with McDonald's and Vodafone, that's not going to make any difference. Probably about 20 years ago, there was the government at the time was sort of petitioned by a lot of franchisees in the Greenacre system because some had lost money, but that was criminal fraud. So the master franchisee went to jail because he lied to people and got an upfront franchise fees. There was a big story about it. So the government looked at it and then said, no, there's no franchise legislation needed in New Zealand at this time. So maybe one day, but the day's not arrived.
So Stewart, just moving on then to the next stage in terms of, you mentioned America, and obviously, as we all know, America has got franchise legislation.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of franchise legislation? What have you seen in obviously your vast international experience? What are the benefits to franchisors and franchisees?
Well, I could liken it too with Australia because Australia is very regulated, even worse than the US now. So the benefits of registration are that there's a mandatory disclosure document, FDD, which has to be registered, and you have to follow. It's a federal offence if the FDD doesn't contain all the items or if you lie. So the benefits of registration, it makes it easier for franchisees probably to take action for misleading and deceptive conduct. But again, we've got the laws in New Zealand. You will have similar laws in the UK. So if I look at Australia, their regulatory body is called the ACCC, and they take action quite regularly against franchisors who get out of kilter, who don't disclose properly. They disclose 80%. They don't disclose all the fees. There might be hidden fees. So those franchisors probably deserve to be clobbered because you have to follow the rules when you have legislation. So the benefit mainly is it may be easier for franchisees to take action. But again, like the UK and New Zealand, you'll have the laws like we do, where you can take action for misleading and deceptive conduct. So that's the main benefit.
Do you think it makes it more open in terms of disclosure, that all franchisors have to disclose information, in effect, that all franchisors should disclose to franchisees?
Well, hold on, Julie. I think you have to be very, very careful about looking at what works or what's been introduced in other countries. In America, there is this disclosure document, registration in 14 states, etc. That reflects the US situation. It's a huge country. There are separate states, so people in in California don't know what's going on in Florida. It's a very entrepreneurial culture, a very pro-litigation culture. Tom Wolfe, the great American novelist, said that once Americans reach 60, litigation replaces sex as their favorite leisure activity. And that sort of conjures up, what the difference in culture. The American system of having this FDD disclosure document, 250 pages plus, is nonsense. I mean, what franchisees actually read 250, 350 pages of information? So I think it would be high risk to say, well, let's model what we're going to have here on what the Americans have done. And as Stewart has pointed out, we're a small country, and the grapevine works here. And banks stop lending to franchisees with a high failure rate. Number one. Number two, we've got the BFA. The BFA is an association where you only get in if your agreement is vetted and you agree to be ethical and make a disclosure. The American equivalent, the IFA, doesn't give a monkeys, providing you can pay the membership fee. You join, and the English courts are protecting the little guys more and more with introducing implied duties of good faith. Misrepresentation claims are really common. So I think it's high risk to see what's going on elsewhere and saying, wouldn't it be a good thing to introduce it here? Because it's so dependent on that country and what applies in that country.
Sorry, can I just chip in here?
Rick?
Can I just chip in? John, absolutely understand and acknowledge where you're coming from. The American FDD is ridiculously complicated. And yeah, we're a small country, but couldn't we make something slightly less complicated?
Rick, you're absolutely right. Look, if I had to devise a franchise law, it would be the following. It would be a simple franchise disclosure document based on the BFA's requirements, a 10-page disclosure, number one. There would be a prohibition on franchise agreements denying liability of the franchisor for misrepresentation claims. Number two, there would be a requirement that franchisors ask or strongly suggest to their franchisees they obtain legal advice. And lastly, there may be a requirement for franchisors to have a registered trademark. Now, that's a really simple franchise law that I don't think would be terribly onerous and could possibly be a good thing.
Thank you. Agreed.
John, can I ask, with the BFA, franchisor members, do they publish a disclosure document? Is that a requirement for the BFA?
It is a requirement of
Yes.
membership of the BFA that they produce a disclosure document. Now, Stewart, it is a requirement that's not always followed, and I'm not sure how closely it's monitored. But back to a point that you made earlier, the real problem for the BFA is that I don't see how they can say to government, we think having a simple disclosure document is a good thing for our members. And then how can they deny that it would be an even better thing for those people who are not members of the BFA? Because the people who are not members of the BFA, sweeping generalization, I know, tend to be, if you're a rogue and a rascal, you're not going to be a member of the BFA. So I think it's very difficult to deny that a simple disclosure document is a good thing.
But a franchise law would level the playing field for everybody in the sector, wouldn't it?
It would, Rick.
So that has to be good.
And Natalia, you've got hand up. Would you like to join the conversation? And Mark will come to you next.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, I just wanted to say, and I absolutely agree with everything that John said and Stewart said, and just want to add to say, we already have laws. They just are not put together and called franchise legislation, but the laws are already there. And B, I sort of feel that if somebody wants to be naughty and do something underhand, they're going to find a way of doing it. So whether you have a requirement for a disclosure document or have another piece of legislation, if somebody wants to get around it, they will find a way. So I don't think, it will prevent cases like, what we're seeing with Vodafone, etc. It's impossible to legislate for 100%, and there will always be those who will try to avoid it. And that's, I think people seem to think that this is going to be the solution, and I really don't think it will. So I agree, there's more we can do, but I see a lot of, more and more franchisors are turning towards, accepting that franchisees getting legal advice is a good thing, and more making it compulsory. I see more and more, saying you can't, we're not going to let you sign the franchise agreement unless you've been to a franchise lawyer and, there is something to say that you've taken, proper legal advice and accounting advice, etc. So we are starting to see the impact of those good practices, being rolled out in the market. I'm just not convinced that, another piece of legislation is going to be the solution, the magic solution that people are hoping for.
Yeah, and again, as there's a non-legal legal in the room, and I accept the point that Rick, that you made earlier, but simple legislation seems like a contradiction in terms of anything that ever happens in this country. But the idea of simple legislation seems to be a great one. The reality, I say non-legally, but I would fear is that no such thing exists. But maybe that's just my cynical view.
I think that would very much depend as to who was asked to draw up the relevant documentation. And just to come back on Natalia's point there, I think psychologically, if you've got yes, there's always going to be the scallywags, but at the moment, everybody's operating under. There's a couple of things. You've got guidelines, which people go, yeah, okay, whatever. They pay scant regard to guidelines. I think if something was labelled law, then I think they'd be just slightly less likely to break the law rather than breach guidelines. And we have, with all due deference to our legals, we have common law in this country where half the time you good people can't agree between yourselves. So all that does ostensibly is ramp up the cost to the franchisor, who is the one who's trying to bring the errant franchisee to right.
Yeah, and again, we have commercial law with misrepresentation, and I mean, interesting that I think it was Stewart who said in New Zealand someone ended up in prison because of it, because it's fraud, and it is fraud. End of. Mark. Sorry, Mark. I just want to bring Mark into the conversation. Rick.
Yeah, this might upset some of the people on this conversation, but I mean, I actually agree with everybody. But I think for me, I've always thought of a simple legislation is that every person or every business that claims to be a franchisor should be registered somewhere, and they have to. And the simple bit for me is they've got to be a member of the BFA. Now, I know some people probably on this call aren't, but at least you go through some hoops and assessment before you're able to practice, if I can use that phrase, as a franchisor. Now, that's maybe I'm being just a little bit too simplistic, but I liken that to something like gas safe, where you have to register to be able to practice. So why not something simple like that rather than legislation? But you probably need legislation to do that in the first place.
James, I think James on the call from the BFA. James, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it would be great, wouldn't it, if every brand, came in and followed the ethics and standards that we set. We do put brands through an accreditation process, and make sure that they meet the standards and ethics that we set, and then we review that through the periodic reaccreditation as well, and always, give feedback and support where needed with brands. So, that process is in place currently. Through the BFA.
Are there any countries, James, where it is a legal requirement to be a member of whatever the franchise association is?
I think that, I know you're shaking your head, Jeff. It isn't Taiwan, from speaking to Simon, or something. There is an Asian country where it is, I believe, but I could be wrong on that one from speaking to Simon about it. But yeah, I couldn't pull it from the top of my head right now.
Okay. So
Julie, the issue is that the government would never pass legislation saying you've got to be a member of the BFA. That will not happen. And there are two problems with legislation. The first is that the only people who are guaranteed to do well from legislation are franchise lawyers. So if you want to make franchise lawyers even richer, pass some legislation. My American colleagues described the extensive franchise legislation in the US as full employment for franchise lawyers law. That's the first problem. The second problem is actually what I see is that those franchisors from the most heavily regulated countries, the USA and Australia, and this is a sweeping generalization, and there's some really good franchisors from those countries. But if I'm allowed to make a generalization, I see them as the least ethical franchisors. And the reason I think for that is that franchisors' focus becomes on complying with the law rather than making sure that their franchisees are supported and successful and so on. So it actually sort of diverts attention of franchisors away from being ethical, good, supportive franchisors. And that's a minus, I think, of legislation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Stewart, obviously you're very much closer to Australia than we are. What's your views and experience about that?
Yeah, well, just a couple of comments. In New Zealand, I think there's three types of franchisors. There's franchisors who belong to the FANZ, comply with the Code of Practice and Ethics. There are franchisors who don't belong to the FANZ, but I still think they're ethical, and they often have a disclosure document, even though they don't need one. And then there's the franchisors who are unethical and, cowboys, and they're in the least favoured ones. With the Code of Practice, I mean, it's looking at disclosure. And every franchise law, when you look at different countries, is looking at a disclosure regime. Now, John said before, I think I heard you correctly, John, that the BFA, when you join, there's not a regular follow-up. Well, in New Zealand, we have an independent scrutineer first, independent, not connected with fans, who looks at the franchise agreement, the disclosure document, and they've got to comply. And not all franchisors who want to join fans are admitted. And the second thing is that franchisors who belong to fans with a disclosure document must update it every year, and that's again checked by the independent scrutineer with changes. So looking at that, and when I compare ours to Australia, which is a great market, it's very similar with the US FDD. So the Australian disclosure document is between sort of 200 and 300 pages, and no one reads them, as John said with the FDD. No one reads that. In New Zealand, the disclosure document's about 20 pages, and it's a pretty easy read. and it has all the gutsy information in. But when I talk to my Australian franchise lawyers with their disclosure document, they just say it's ridiculous. The code of conduct has gone crazy. They keep having reviews every few years and make it more onerous on franchisors. And if you step outside the rule book, you can get financially clobbered or prosecuted by the ACCC. So, again, I think New Zealand's very similar to the UK. We've got associations of high standard with ethics. And I took on board, Rick, your comments about if we have franchise, legislation, it might be easier. But again, it's only going to be looking at disclosure, and disclosure, if you don't tell the truth and you're found out, there is laws that exist in both of our countries to jump on lying franchisors.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to some degree, you could argue, you look at the people on this call and we're kind of talking to the converted because, we're all part to some degree of the franchise community. And on that basis, we all want franchising to grow, to prosper, to do well. And certainly from our point of view, we have noticed a significant drop over the last 12, 15 months in terms of businesses coming into franchising as a way to expand their businesses, strategically, basically. And I don't think it's just us. I think it's, common across most of the, again, good ethical development franchise consultants. So there's some form of disincentive happening in the marketplace. It's either related to the economy, it's related to Rachel Reeves, it's related to NI, whatever it is, basically. And my question is, given that we want the UK economy to grow, given that we want franchising to be a significant part of that, given that we want successful franchises and successful small businesses, would franchise legislation be a disincentive to any business owner looking to grow their business and thinking about whether franchising could be the strategic option for them to select?
The answer to that, Julie, depends in a large part to what sort of legislation there is. The simpler legislation, simple disclosure, you can't exclude misrepresentation claims, you've got to have a registered trademark, and you advise franchisees to get legal advice. I don't think would have a positive or negative impact on franchise recruitment. It would be relatively inexpensive for franchisors to put in place. I'm not convinced it would do any harm.
And John, do you genuinely think that simple legislation is a possibility?
Yes, I do actually. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think the challenge for the BFA, and I'm a huge fan of the BFA, and Stewart, when I said about monitoring disclosure, what I said was I don't know how carefully it's monitored. So I certainly was not saying that it wasn't
Monitored.
It wasn't monitored. So look, if I was advising the BFA, and they certainly don't need my advice, and haven't asked for my advice, but that's not going to stop me. I would say when you're approaching the government, if you approach the government with, we're completely against legislation, no, you can't do legislation, I think they won't take you seriously. I think a better approach is, look, we have an open mind over legislation. There are pluses and minuses. All we would say is if there is legislation, it's got to be simple, it's got to be inexpensive, and it's got to be sensible. And I think that approach is likely to be much more successful with government than saying, no, we're completely against legislation.
Interesting.
So in New Zealand, the Franchise Association has an advocacy committee, and they talk to government and they talk to the opposition. So they go down to Wellington and meet with the Minister of Small Business, because the government is very interested in franchising from the point of view of the power of it and what it contributes in the economy with turnover. And when you add the petroleum, the petrol in, there's $73.4 billion of turnover in New Zealand. And that was in the 2024 survey. So instead of the Franchise Association closing its eyes, they actually actively talk to government. And what's happened there is the government then made immigration easier. And the Franchise Association had a big win about because we were short of labour in the service industries. And so we've had a lot of people from the Philippines, especially with rest homes. So immigration's got easier into New Zealand because of, an approach from the Franchise Association in relation to that. And also because there can be change of governments, and certainly in the UK, you've had a few. In Australia, they've had a lot. You talk to the opposition as well, the relevant Minister of Business. So it's not ignored, but I just don't think there's a need for any sort of regulation. Or what's the danger is once you introduce some regulation, a Franchise Act, it can be amended. So it comes in on day one with 20 sections, which are easy, like John says. And then within 6 months, someone has this bright idea to amend it because there's been a complaint and it doubles in length. And you never intended that. And you think, oh my God, I wish we hadn't had it at all. And I've seen that happen.
James, I don't know whether I know Pip was going to join us today, but she's on a different meeting. James, I don't know whether you want to
Yes, yeah.
have anything to add, whether anything you want to share, can share, wish to share.
Yeah, I mean, look, we are, in conversations. That's, I don't know what or how much to share, to be fair. So yeah, look, there'll be more that comes out from us shortly. So
okay, thank you.
Total disclosure, James. Total disclosure in the spirit of franchising.
Do you talk to the government, James, so actively?
yes,
The BFA,
yeah,
like the
yes,
FANZ does.
yes.
Yeah, great.
I
Okay.
think there's another important point to pull up here. I think our New Zealand colleague suggested that about half of your franchisors are members of your association. In the UK, I think I'm right, James. You got what, 250 members?
350 plus.
Franchisor members.
Franchisor members, yes.
Okay, so yeah, okay, tickling quarter, maybe a third. There's a huge disparity between members and non-members, and I just feel that a Franchise Act, I mean, it would be helpful all round because it just brings everybody into play. It levels the playing field, and I think to work this slightly negative in a negative connotation, I think what we need to say, or would be suggesting to the likes of government and co, is look, what we don't want is something as ridiculous as they have in America or as ludicrous as they have in Australia. Just get the whole thing, simplify it, talk to the legal people in the UK, but talk to the franchisors. They're the ones who are likely going to be struggling, suffering, paying the bills, and so on and so forth. Talk to the people that really matter.
Yeah, James, as you know, Rick has been a member of the BFA for how many years now, Rick?
I was in it for 10 years and I've been out of it for longer than that.
All right, okay, that's fine. We're very, very experienced franchisor, so you know where to.
I've got 30 years under my belt, so.
Yeah, and again, experience of working in Australia with your master franchisee in Australia as well.
We do.
My final question to the two, which I'm going to come on to in a second, is about predicting the future. So anyone that wants to know what the lottery numbers are for the weekend, John Pratt is going to give us those. Not just me personally, John. But before we go on to the predictions, Stewart, is there anything that you want to add from an operational point of view, from an experience point of view, from an international point of view, things that you've seen that are good or bad, basically, before we go on to the future predictions?
From an international point of view, I can just say for quite a few years at the IFA convention, I've done a round table of franchising in the Asia Pacific region, about 16 countries, and you have lots of people attending your round tables. And invariably, the discussion comes down to different countries with their laws, but it talks about disclosure, but it also talks about how easy is it for a person to become a franchisee? What should they do? And a key emphasis is intellectual property. So I'm amazed that international franchisors who register their trademarks late in the countries, they should do it early. So from an international point of view, IP protection is essential. And the only other point I would make is in franchising, keep litigation out of franchising, so which is where mediation and arbitration comes into its own because of the relationship between franchisors and franchisees. So this, I don't like litigators who get involved in franchising unless there's a real need, because they mess it up. They're, except for the non-compete clauses, which I mentioned before, which have to be enforced. So they were my comments.
Are there any countries, Stewart, that do have, and again, come back to John in a second, do have, simple legislation that actually does work and is effective? Or, I mean, we know about Australia, we know about America, very complex, very high cost, potentially barring disincentives to, to companies to come into the sector. Are there any countries that you're aware of that have?
Yeah, John's nodding his head. Go on, John. Tell us.
Yes, there are a
Yes.
number of countries. I mean, the first European country to introduce legislation was France. They introduced the Loi du Bain, and it's not specific to franchising. It's regulates trademark licensing in effect, and that's a simple disclosure document. Which is required. And as far as I can tell, has not caused problems in France at all. In a number of European countries, Spain has relatively simple registration requirements, and so on. So it is by no means the case that countries all model themselves on either Australia or the US, thank goodness.
Okay, so there is a model potentially that works, that is effective.
Well,
as much as we know.
There's a model out there. Whether it's effective, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to do any harm. And certainly when curiously, you might think, when I'm talking to American or Australian franchisors, the fact that we don't have any franchise legislation, no extensive disclosures and so on, doesn't seem to be on their radar. They don't think, they neither think it's a good thing or a bad thing. What they think is a good thing is that legal fees are going to be much less than in the US, but sort of they're not attracted to the UK because of the lack of legislation, in my view.
Wow, interesting. And in terms of any other, before we come on to your prediction for the future, John, any other operational legal aspects that you've seen in other countries, that you'd like to bring to the table?
You bet. I completely agree with Stewart that you want to keep litigation lawyers out of franchising. I have never been involved in a dispute between a franchisor and a franchisee, which has gone to court, where the winning party has thought that was good. I'm very pleased I litigated. Okay, so it is almost always the least good way of sorting disputes. But I think franchise lawyers need to focus on the increasing disputes between franchisees. The reason for the increase is obviously the internet. So franchisees constantly share, information and share complaints, and they wind each other up. And the other thing that's much more recent is AI. The number of franchisees who go on AI and get legal advice as to their rights is increasing hugely. So I think franchisors, and I'm sort of jumping ahead, Julie, in your next point, I think franchisors need to be aware that disputes is on the rise, that they need to be aware that when they're providing information to franchisees before they enter into the franchise agreement, they've got to make sure that information is not plucked out of thin air, and they can justify it. So when they produce this lovely prospectus saying that you can earn in the first year 250,000, second year 500,000, and the third year £1 million, they have to base those figures on actual franchisee average performance. And so they do need to focus and get lawyers involved in that. And the second thing they need to do is that us commercial lawyers have got to start thinking differently. There's a tendency, and I'm guilty of this as anyone, here's your franchise agreement, off you go. Well, actually, we've only done part of the job there. What we actually need to say is these are the likely, areas of dispute. These are the systems you need to put in place to monitor those disputes, properly react to them, and so on. So I think unfortunately for franchisors, a bigger focus on resolving disputes is the way forward.
Well, I think you've just started to define what could be a future First Friday there, John, in terms of what franchisors should be doing. And Stewart, do you think that New Zealand will continue to operate in the future without franchise legislation?
In the future, yes, but inevitably, I think we will get it, but not yet, because there's really only UK, Singapore, New Zealand, maybe a couple of others that don't have it. But again, why is there a need for it? It's either a government initiative or there's adverse press about franchising. It only takes a couple of cases to bring it in, and that was the case in Australia. So in 1995, New Zealand was part of the Australian and New Zealand Franchise Association, and there was a case there, the cut price deli system in Queensland, where the franchisor misrepresented to the franchisee. Just like John says, if you open an outlet in the shopping mall, you will make $500,000, whatever. And it was so out of kilter, so the franchisee sued the franchisor and complained to the press. And that was the catalyst to bring in legislation in Australia, really one case. And we could see that happening. So we broke away from Australia in 96, and then Australia got legislation the next year. So inevitably there could be, but not today.
Okay. John?
Look, I think the BFA will resist legislation. I mean, I can think of, and I'm sort of neutral about that. I'm not neutral about the approach. I think they should indicate in discussions with government an open mind. Tactically, I think they should. But I can't help thinking that there must be 150 other laws that are going to be much more important and beneficial to introduce than franchise laws. It can't be a high priority. And the government needs to be very careful about doing anything that might have a negative impact on this extraordinarily successful sector. I mean, I see on a day-to-day basis our clients very often, obviously we represent big brands, but with little brands, these are set up by people who have not had a privileged background, haven't had a fantastic university education, often from ethnic minorities and so on. There isn't anything in this country that offers the underprivileged a way to get into business which is better than franchising. And I do hope the BFA emphasises that.
Yes, well said, John. I mean, entrepreneurs, they come and go, and they should be encouraged, and that's where it's very exciting for franchising, because they can use the model and expand.
Great, thank you. Well, I am going to open the questions to the floor. In the meantime, while you're all thinking about, we've got probably a chance for a couple more questions. I just wanted to, as usual, get the QR code and the feedback. If any of you want to make contact, obviously we all kind of, know and love John and know how to contact him. If anyone would like the chance to have a chat with Stewart, please complete the QR code, give us the feedback on the event today, and obviously, put that you'd like to make contact with Stewart, and we'll put in touch with you. Put you in touch with him directly. And also any ideas for future events. We're always looking for great ideas, great guest speakers, and I think we might have one from the topic today as well. Next event, which is in August, we're looking at property again. Another, as John might say, very interesting topic, but very important. We've got the property detective who specialises in working with franchisors and franchisees, how to find the right commercial property, and we all know it can make or break your franchise, and how to do it basically. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and we have hands raised. Kat, I think you have your hand raised. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Over to you.
It's really just a thought that has come about as a result of today's session and hearing what people have to say. But obviously, right at the very beginning, the thing that was mentioned was the public perception of franchising because of the high-profile cases of McDonald's and Vodafone. Even if simple legislation at its simplest form, perhaps of just the registration, the requirement to register, but even if it comes in at the simplest form, even though, as John said right at the beginning, that the issues with McDonald's and Vodafone, it wouldn't make any difference what legislation there is. But in terms of public perception, in terms of public perception, would it make a difference by having some legislation in place, however basic, in relation to the fact that there is a bit of bad press going on about those cases, in particular the Vodafone one at the moment. Would it make a difference to public perception, even though it wouldn't actually make any difference to the outcomes of those cases?
Okay, James, I don't know whether there's been any, probably not any research, but whether you've got any views on that.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. But there's no research on that yet. We are underway with the new industry research off the back of the 2024 launch. So there'll be some different questions in that one as well. But yeah, I mean, I get what Kat's saying. I think, we see the perception of franchising is there's still more work to be done on that, and that's what we're actively trying to do. It's one of the big three objectives that we had and we discussed at the AGM, is more kind of positive public promotion of franchising and the changes that it can make to people. So that's something that we're continuously working on at the moment.
Thank you, John.
Julie, can I come in on this?
Yeah.
The Vodafone case, I mean, we've got to be careful because it's, going through the courts. But the problem with the Vodafone case is that before the BFA got involved, Vodafone issued a franchise agreement to their managers. They converted a load of managers to a franchise. Most of them did not get that franchise agreement reviewed. Now, I mean, that was just dumb because, and I know that for a fact, because I actually reviewed the Vodafone franchise agreement for a prospective franchisee. And I literally put in the report, you would be mad to enter into this agreement because it gave the franchisors great discretion to increase fees, to impose commissions and all of those sort of things. So the real problem with legislation is it can never stop people doing stupid things, like however annoying it is to use lawyers and expensive it is, getting an agreement checked. But Kath, you raise a very good question. about the public perception. And like you, I do wonder whether having some franchise laws would, in a curious way, increase the perception, the PR of franchising, and might, I don't know, in a curious way, be a plus for franchising.
Indeed. And John, did the potential franchisee take your advice?
No,
Did they went ahead?
but
Didn't run a
Julie,
mile.
you're a very, very naughty woman, Julie, because you would know the answer to that is no, because you know that my clients very infrequently take my advice.
That's not the truth at all, John, but I have to say it's made my afternoon. Mark, last question.
Yeah, actually, John, that plays right into my comment earlier about registering first before you can trade as a franchisor. So in that instance, Vodafone would never have been able to trade with such an agreement in place. So actually, being a member of the BFA before, obviously they would have changed. I guess they changed that subsequently to be a member.
They did, yes.
But of course that didn't help. And that's the point. We've got to do something to help those people. They may have been adamant that they'd have been out of a job if they hadn't have signed as well. Somebody else would have taken that on. So that is absolutely my reasoning for that, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? Because at the time I was with NatWest, and Vodafone didn't talk to any banker that knew what they were talking about either. They got Barclays to fund their franchisees, and they weren't even in the BFA either at the time. So it was the blind leading the blind around that. So they seem to know what they're doing now, but, well, do they? I don't know. But
Okay, well, on that happy note, I am going to cease the recording. Thank you for all attending.